Welcome to Books in the Freezer, a podcast dedicated to the deliciously disturbing world of horror fiction. I'm your host, Stephanie, and for this very special episode, I am joined by Konrad Stump and author Daniel Kraus to talk about the Summer Scares program. So, welcome to the show.
Thanks for having us.
Yep, thanks.
So, would you tell our listeners all about what the Summer Scares program is?
Yeah, of course. So, Summer Scares is the Horror Writers Association's summer reading program. It's been going on since 2017, so we're going into our sixth year. And essentially, each year we select 9 titles, 3 for adults, 3 for teens, and 3 for middle grade. And the point of the reading initiative is really to engage libraries with the horror genre so that they can connect with their communities either through displays or book discussion groups or programming. So essentially, we're providing this list of vetted titles so that librarians can feel comfortable recommending these to their patrons and planning things around them. Because a lot of times some librarians love horror, which, we love those librarians, but we also love the librarians who are kind of scared of it. And so that is part of what this is all about, is we are here to make horror less scary for people to enjoy.
So, this is a program they can choose to be a part of.
Yes, they can choose to kind of have where they want. So, right, the easiest way is displays. They can either take those 9 titles, create a display around them. Part of what we do is provide read-alikes for each title. So, basically, if you enjoy that title, you might also enjoy these 4 titles. So, basically, every year you're getting these 9 core titles, but you're getting like 36 titles that you could plan a display around. So that's kind of the easiest way for libraries to kind of engage with the program. And then I'd say the next level up would be book discussion groups, right? So
Yeah.
if you have a horror book discussion group, you could do a title for each month of the summer, or for 9 months you could do it. But you could also just incorporate one of these kind of spooky titles into your book discussion group, because again, a lot of times people think that they don't like spooky stuff, but then they like Stranger Things, or a lot of times people like movie horror, but they think that they don't like book
Yeah.
horror. And so working those into book discussion groups is kind of a good way for people to access that. And then of course, like the sort of top level of engaging with the program is sort of holding public events based around the books.
That's exciting. I used to love summer reading programs at the
Mm-hmm.
library as a kid, so I feel like this scratches that itch.
Most
Um,
definitely.
is there something library patrons can do to be involved or encourage their local libraries?
Yeah, I would say, I mean, right. Libraries are a community hub. And so, everyone from the patrons to the librarians are part of that community. And it's sort of like a collection, right? It's a circulating collection. So it's a relationship. And so patrons can request that their libraries get involved. The librarians might not know about it. So if patrons want to discuss it with their local librarians, they can. And then sort of just let them know that there is that audience
Mhm.
in their community for horror programming and for discussion around the horror genre. So sometimes it's just about awareness, and so your library might not be aware, and that's kind of the best thing that regular people who are not librarians or horror authors or publishers can do.
Okay. I don't think my local library are big horror fans from what I've seen.
Yeah, it varies.
So, what are the titles for this year?
Yes, definitely. Let's go down the list. So, like I said, we choose 3 titles in 3 different categories: adult, YA, and middle grade. So, our 3 titles for the adult category this year are Ring Shout by P. Jelly Clark, Catherine House by Elizabeth Thomas, and The Merry Spinster Tales of Everyday Horror by Daniel M. Lavery. Our 3 young adult selections for 2023 are In the Shadow of Blackbirds by Kat Winters, Squad by Maggie Takuta Hall and Lisa Sterrell, Mooncakes by Suzanne Walker and Wendy Shu, And then our three middle grade titles are Small Spaces by Catherine Arden, Living Ghosts by Dan Saucely Jones, and A Small Zombie Problem by KG Campbell.
Ooh, a lot of good titles there.
Yeah, most definitely. And a lot of nice variety.
Yeah. Um, Dan, were you involved with the selection process this year, or do you know what goes into that?
Yeah, I was. It's a highly scientific process in
Ooh.
which well, it actually is kind of. I mean, we all put forth what titles are sort of on our radar, and we ask each other, more or less, what have you been reading over the past X number of years? How many years are we allowed to go back, Conrad?
I think about 10 years or so. So I
Okay.
think our cap for 2023 was 2013. So nothing before 2013.
Right. And one of my favorite parts of Summer Squares is the fact that it does operate on this sort of back catalog, because so many of the awards and lists and presentations that you're aware of are always new books. But and it's very hard to get a grasp of what's great and new. But as things age, there are certain things that really, as a horror reader and a horror fan, stick with you. And
Hmm.
so it's almost in a way easier and more effective in a way to be able to look back and say, what were the things over the
Yeah.
past whatever you just said, however many years, 10 years, whatever it was, that still I think about all the time. And certainly in my case, which ones do I feel haven't got their due necessarily? Which ones
Yeah.
haven't gotten as many readers as I would like them to? And then we look at the list and we sort of challenge the list a little bit. Is it as varied as possible? Have you is it missing something? Because we do want this to be a sort of broad picture of horror that will satisfy not just young and old, but
Yeah.
also people who are into something that's a little more extreme, or people who are into something that's a little gentler or more spooky, as opposed to just straight on terrifying.
Yeah.
So just like every other genre, horror is a huge spectrum that, except for a pretty small population, everyone likes horror a little bit, at least. They might not realize it, but I think generally it's one of those genres that really, there's something for everyone, probably, and we want the list to reflect that.
I would agree with that. So yeah, you try to get a varied level of scares all around.
Yeah, definitely. And so, we want things that appeal to different people because, you might be into like extreme horror is really big right now. And body horror is really big right now. But, you might be someone who wants more of like a gothic chiller. So just sort of, a nice little, oh, maybe something's amiss in this house where I've just become a governess. Uh, and, maybe that's your level of scare. And then, a couple other things that are really important in the selection process is that we want gender parity. And so, the list cannot be, more, and we don't have a difficult time achieving this by any means, but, sometimes horror can be viewed as like a very white cishet male genre, but it's actually a very diverse and inclusive genre. And so, one of our parameters is that it can't be essentially more than 50% like cishet white males. And so then we also want to make sure that there's a lot of diversity on the list. And so we have to have at least 30% diverse authors, right? And so those are just sort of benchmarks that we're looking at in the selection process to make sure that we are definitely meeting those because they are so important.
So it is a big scientific thing.
A little bit, yeah, sometimes.
I love that. It's a lot of great titles. I was telling Dan earlier, like I've read all of the adult titles and I've loved all of them, and they are very diverse in vibe and what they're going for. And I'm currently making my way through the YA ones, and it's been very fun. I've been very pleasantly surprised, even with the two graphic novels. Mooncakes is very sweet and cozy. And now I'm going into squad and I'm like, oh, we're dealing with like body horror werewolves. Like, okay. Very different vibe from Mooncakes, but I am here for it.
Yeah, it was an interesting discussion with the group, because I don't think that we've had two graphic novels within the same category before. But, different members of the committee were passionate about both of the books. And so we thought, well, they have this sort of very different approach in what they are doing, this whole different vibe. So why not just include both of them? It's kind of scientific, but at the same time, we make the rules. And so, there's nothing saying that we can't have two graphic novels in YA. So I'm really glad that both of those are on the list this year.
Oh, yeah,
Yeah,
absolutely.
and I hope more people do what you're doing and just sort of drill through the list. I think one of the great things about lists like this is that these days, especially, we're so sort of programmed by algorithms to sort of like a certain thing and then be fed more of that thing. And exploration has degraded somewhat, I think, into exploring sort of very narrowly off what you're already sort of into. And this is a good way to really go back to those days of standing in sort of the Blockbuster where
Oh, yeah.
there's a finite number of titles, but the chances of sort of revelation and discovery really ramp up in that case because you're not being just given something that you're already used to. If you're really into something like Catherine House, there's a good chance you've never read something like Ring Shout, but this is a good opportunity
Yeah.
to reach out a little bit and find out that you love subgenres that you maybe didn't even know existed.
Yeah, definitely. And I mean, especially if I'm at the library and I see this on an end cap, they look appealing. So I'm going to say at my library, I mean, I don't know if it's most libraries, horror is just kind of in there with the general fiction. So I feel like I have to have my list of like specifically what I'm looking for or like the authors that I'm like, okay, that's a horror author. I've never read that title. I guess that looks like a spooky spine. Let me check it out.
Mhm.
Yeah, the book cover marketing can be helpful, and there are some authors who kind of fall into the horror category, but their publisher wants to market them as sort of general fiction. But there are still those indicators, right? And like the words that are used on the cover, the image on the cover, and that kind
Mhm.
of let the reader know, like, okay, maybe this is my vibe. But to both of your points about going through the list and kind of experiencing something new and different, I think it was 2020. Does that sound right? Gosh, that we had um, the Cipher by Kathy Koja. And before that, I thought that I didn't like body horror because I had this idea of what body horror was. And I thought that it wasn't for me. But then I read that and I really loved it. And I was like, oh, okay, I'm kind of into this. And then I read The Rust Maidens by Gwendolyn Keist and I really loved that. And so now, I've kind of gone from this person who thought that I didn't like body horror because I had this idea of what it was to being someone who actually really enjoys it.
Yeah, that's good. We made a believer out of you.
Yeah.
So, are there different big events planned for the summer?
Yeah, so basically, we'll have a few things planned, but things really kick off in June at StokerCon during Librarians Day, right? So StokerCon, for anyone who doesn't know, of course, is basically like the horror conference, and it's where the Stoker Award is given out, which is one of the biggest honors that you can get. As a horror writer. And so each year, Becky Sprafford and I coordinate Librarians Day, which is a day long continuing education experience, right? So librarians can come and we'll have different panels and, they can kind of learn how to engage their communities with the horror genre. They could hear from other librarians from across the country about how they've done it. They'll hear from authors and publishers. And so at the end of the day, on Librarians Day, we'll have a Summer Scares panel. So people will get to meet some of the authors, spokespeople. Dan will be there. and get introduced to the program if they're not already aware of it. And so kind of throughout the summer we'll be working to connect libraries with the program and try to coordinate some author visits and discussions based around the titles at libraries across the country. So um, it's kind of a fun rollout over the summer of just
Yeah.
programs at different libraries. Yeah,
So yeah, definitely. If you are a librarian, it sounds like a can't miss event if you're in the Pittsburgh area.
definitely.
And we will have stuff planned for the podcast. I'm going to do different episodes for each age group and do kind of read alikes and discussions about each of the picks. So an adult episode, YA episode, and middle grade episode. Got some guests lined up.
Excellent.
Very exciting. Yeah.
Yeah. So you said there was also a programming guide.
Yeah, that's right. So each year for the past few years, the Springfield Greene County Library in beautiful Springfield, Missouri, for which I work, creates a Summer Scares programming guide. So essentially, this is a guide that libraries can use to plan things for their communities, sort of as I mentioned earlier, whether that's displays, book discussions, or programs. And so each of the 9 Summer Scares titles gets their own page in this guide. And so it'll have an overview of the book. It'll have sort of appeal factors that we work with Yika Sabat from Novelist on, and read alikes that we also work with Yika on. And then it'll have ideas for sort of how to use those appeal factors to book talk the books, right? Either to patrons or if you want to talk about it on sort of whatever social media stuff, book buzz that you might do for your library. And then we have book discussion guides. So it's essentially a set of like 7 questions for book discussion groups to sort of use, at least as a jumping off point, to kind of know what they can ask their groups about in regards to the book. And then it has 4 sample programs for each title. And so essentially, right, those are public events that librarians can plan for their communities. And, the first option is always like a Q&A with the author, because it's an easy event. And, that's sort of like the highlight if you were planning a whole series for your community would be your kind of keynote author event. And then we'll have different things. I think a lot of times I'll suggest partnering with a local theater to view a movie. And so for Squad this year, which is about like teenage girl werewolves seeking their own justice against predatory men, I've suggested holding a viewing of Jennifer's Body.
I was going to
Um,
say, I'm like, it's got to
yeah, I
be.
mean, I love Jennifer's Body. And, then having a discussion after that about some of the, social issues and gender issues that Jennifer's Body is exploring. So that's kind of one idea that I might have. And then the other really cool thing about programming for libraries in general is like, especially when it comes to horror, is every community is going to have, ghost stories, urban legends. They're going to have sort of, famous murders in their community. There's always something spooky in the history of your town. And so a lot of times there will be something like that. So last year we had the remaking by Clay McLeod Chapman, and that's sort of like based on an urban legend, and that urban legend is perpetuated over time. And so, one of the suggested programs was urban legends of whatever town you're in. And so, you just kind of partner with either like people in your local history department, or whoever your local history person might be if you're a smaller library, or experts in the area from whatever that means, if it's a college, or if it's just genuinely someone who is like interested and has written about it. So there's all kinds of stuff to do. And I think a lot of times for people, especially who don't have a lot of experience planning public programming, it can be scary to know, like, how do I even start? And so that's really what the sample programs are for, is to kind of show you what the ideas are that you can kind of play around with and what programs you might plan. So, and then in addition to the pages for the 9 titles, we'll also have an article this year by Ben Rubin, who is in charge of the Horror Studies archives at Pitt. And so he'll talk a bit about the archives and sort of their connection to Summer Scares. And then at the back of the guide, last year we kind of debuted this easy guide for like new and upcoming books by Summer Scares authors and spokespeople. And so it's kind of just a nifty little, 14-page guide to get people excited about Summer Scares and get them planning things for their communities.
Oh, that does sound really nifty.
Hmm. I love
That
it.
urban legends thing sounds fun.
Yeah, it's super cool. And the other thing that I should say is like, I've been doing public programming for a number of years, 7 or 8, and horror programming is some of the most popular programming, and especially local history programming that has like a spooky aspect to it. I mean, people really um, are drawn to that, and
Yeah.
so it's a surefire sort of popular event for your community to plan something in connection with Summer Scares that has a local history slant to it.
I love that. Yeah, if you're a librarian, gotta get on that. And Dan, what was your connection to the library in this program?
Oh, I mean, everything Conrad's saying just, you know, makes this kind of an exercise in wish fulfillment for me. Growing up in a small town in Iowa, we had actually this beautiful little library, this old Carnegie Library.
Hmm.
I think was the first library west of the Mississippi. I think was its distinction.
Really?
Quite small, but really interesting architecture, and by I think its very nature of its age and its design was sort of a spooky place to me. Like it's sort of in a good way. I mean, I like that kind of thing. But there were these sort of alabaster like statues, and there's something very like you could imagine ghosts in the stacks in that place. But it was a situation where, as a young reader of horror, I didn't know where the horror was,
Yeah.
like, and it makes sense that the horror would just be shelved with everything else. I get that, but there was no way, particularly back then, pre-internet, for me to find any of it. I had to know the names, so Stephen King, but I can tell you right to this day, I can tell you right where the K section was, but to find anything else was virtually impossible. I would have to run across it in life, which was very difficult at that point. So the idea of having a selection like this or any kind of programming that wasn't aimed at the littlest kids, because
Yeah.
they had that, and I have very good positive memories of that kind of stuff, including ones that were also kind of scary and spooky. So that must have been like a Halloween event or something. But if they had done any kind of display work or programming, particularly if it wasn't around Halloween, that would have been especially exciting. I think we tend to slot
Yeah.
genres into horror at Halloween, romance in February, et cetera, et cetera. But that's cutting selling everything short. Like all those genres belong everywhere and they cross pollinate furiously. Um, and so yeah, for me growing up, the library was where I found everything, and a lot of it was just roaming through the stacks. And then as an adult, I became a librarian. I got my master's degree at the University of Illinois, and I was a librarian for a time. And then I worked for the American Library Association for many years, and worked for the magazine Booklist, and so spent a good 10 years writing book reviews and editing book reviews. And I was the horror guy there, so I just I would read multiple horror books every week. So I'm sort of steeped in the librarian horror book subculture, whatever that
Yeah.
is, and to be able to kind of feed back into that, to sort of feed back into the engine that built me, is very satisfying, and exciting, and you you wonder what kind of minds will be molded and created by reading these picks, just as I was by stumbling across a Clive Barker book or something, and it
Oh, yeah.
changed me. Like, it really changed me. And I have no doubt that there will be people out there who read books, one of these 9 books, and they will be changed. and it will influence their lives. And maybe they'll become like me and they'll become an author, but maybe it'll just be something that broadens their view of society and the world. And I'm biased, of course, but I do think the horror genre is one of the most mind expanding and culturally expansive genres. By its very nature, it's a genre on the edge.
Yeah.
And societal change and development happens from the edges, the outsides in. And so normally you see these exciting kind of changes hit horror first. They are sort of the bellwether, or the canary in the coal mine in a good way, that things are changing and developing. So I'm just thrilled to be a part of all of that.
Absolutely. And you've been on the side of being an author where your book is one of the Summer Scares picks. So what's it like being on both sides of that?
Yeah, right. I think the very first year of Summer Scares, my young adult book Broaders was on the list. And so it was sort of a brand new program and initiative at that point. But it was great. Like it was, I did various library events, some in person, some online, interviews here and there. And it was, what's particularly satisfying for an author is that you only ever get to talk about your new books. And to be able to jump back to Rodders, which came out 2012 or 2011, I think, was so cool. Like to be able to jump back into a world, you just don't ever do that, particularly if you're prolific and like me, where I'm putting out a book or two a year. Anything beyond a couple of years ago is just lost in a fog. So an excuse to go back and engage in that material again and remember to take a breath and remember why you wrote it and how it affected people and how it affected me as the author was really interesting and provocative, and gave me a reason to sort of reflect on my career in a way that maybe I hadn't before. So it was a great experience, and I particularly think that the authors whose books are on the older end that were published quite a few years ago will have that kind of same experience, and it's a really rich one, I think. And you along with the positive, you as an author, you'll find things in the book you're like, oh, I would write that differently today or whatever. But it's still an enriching experience, and one where you get to analyze sort of a younger version of yourself, and that's always very interesting, and that's something I think we get to do very often.
Well, that is interesting. Yeah, because I mean, I'm not an author, but I assume your books are like your children. Then you just put them out into the world.
Yeah, you don't keep them very long. You have them, then you get rid of them fast.
That is interesting. Yes, I was going to say, you are someone who I consider to be very prolific. Every time I see your name popping up, you have like one or two things coming out, and it just blows my mind. Like you have Whale Fall coming out this year, and then was there something else as well? I think there was.
This year I've got. Last year I had 4 books come out, 4 novels come out, which was excessive. Even for me, it was excessive and difficult to keep up with. It was actually almost problematic. Like it was I couldn't fully support everything. It was too much. So I'm going to try to slow down just a tad. This year I had the 3rd book in the Teddy's trilogy, and then I have Whale Fall, which comes out, which was maybe my favorite book I've ever done. That comes out in August.
Oh, I'm excited about that. I'll say I don't think I've emotionally recovered from Bet Heavens. I think that one hit me in the heart.
That's a tough one. That's one of Bet Heavens and Scowler are probably my darkest books. They leave a mark.
Yeah. Well, I think the last time you were on and we spoke, it was to talk about Bent Heavens and the Living Dead. And I hadn't finished Bent Heavens. I think when we spoke, I was still halfway through it. So I hadn't even gotten to the life-ruining moment.
Yes. Yeah. That's one of the advantages that Scowler has, is the life-ruining moment is like in the first 50 pages. So it ruins your life early, so then you can just kind of relax and
your side. Here for the life-ruining moments, and horror is so good for that. Like if you want like Q horror, if you want emotional devastation, there's all kinds of titles out there. All right. Well, a tradition that we have on this podcast is to ask our guests for a chilling obsession or something that they've been enjoying in horror lately. So, what have you all been enjoying?
Conrad, do you have something ready to roll?
Oh, so okay, a couple things. Because I'm greedy and I have to choose two. Uh, so remember earlier when I mentioned being a governess, the the thing that I feel is kind of big, and maybe this is just like in England, are these gothic chillers. And I feel like there are a lot of them that I've been seeing, and I am a sucker for them. So I read The Silent Companions by Laura Purcell a few years ago, and it was one of the scariest books that I have read recently. And yeah, there are all these books. There's The Toll House by Carly Regan. There's The House of Footsteps by Matthew West. And so it's kind of like, someone going to a remote home, either to be a governess or to like catalog a library. And, maybe there's a ghost, maybe there isn't, but there probably is. So just that sort of like sense of unease, that atmosphere, that potential for a haunting. Um, I'm really into that. And then I'm also super into, of course, like the amount of queer horror that we're seeing right now. And so I feel like, when I was growing up as a young gay boy, when I was growing up, there weren't like people that I had that, authors who I knew of that were writing characters like me. And I feel like right now there are so many people writing queer horror, and it's super exciting to see. Um, because you almost, my experience is that I almost forget to make sure that I'm reading books about queer people, because I'm so used to reading sort of heteronormative fiction. But I am very excited about the amount of options that I have now to see characters that are LGBTQIA plus. It's super cool.
Yeah, I'm going to mention a movie and a book. A few days ago, just I saw a movie called The Outwaters that I just absolutely loved. One of the scariest films I've ever seen, and I don't ever really get scared. So I highly recommend that. And on the book side, I recently read and blurbed a debut novel called The Center by Ayesha Menazir Siddiqui. I may or may not be saying that right. That is really interesting and really different. It's one of those books where I'm not sure if it'll be marketed as horror or not, but there's a piece to it that's really unclear for a large point of the book that when it clicks in is really horrifying. So look out for that one. I think that's also coming out in August.
Oh, okay. What's it about?
It's about a woman who is a translator, like a book translator, or maybe she does movie subtitles as well. And she learns of this secret institute where you can go and completely master language in 2 weeks by just listening to these tapes of people in a different language telling you the voice, just talking about their life. And then suddenly
Okay.
one day you understand the language, and it's a real mystery how it works. And it is just one of the most page turning things. And I can't really say any more without spoiling it, but it's like sort of a drama, literary fiction type of book that makes this turn that is such a great horror reveal. That no one's going to see it coming. It's a truly,
No.
truly great twist in this one.
I am very intrigued. So I will definitely be on the lookout for that. For an upcoming episode, I recently watched for the first time the 2011 film adaptation for We Need to Talk About Kevin.
Mm.
I loved the book, but the book was one of those like, uncomfortable reading experiences, life ruining types of stories. So I was like, I don't know that I'm prepared or in the right mindset to watch a film adaptation. And it was great. It was also just like a beautiful movie. Tilda
Yeah.
Swinton is fantastic in it. Just great performances all around. I would say like totally a bit different from the book, where I think like the book. I mean, I'm getting more into like what I'm talking about for the next episode, but I think she's like the main character Eva is kind of like struggling between like the nature and nurture and like, is it my fault? Is he just like a spawn of Satan child? Where I think the movie definitely kind of leans like specifically one way on that. But I absolutely loved it. So I'm really glad I finally sat down and watched it on Tubi. Tubi also gave me like a birth control commercial like halfway through it, and I was like, apt.
It never gives me that.
That's not on your algorithm.
No.
Well, the final tradition that we have on this podcast is to ask our guests for a final girl song. So, what are you choosing for your final girl song?
I'll go first this time. I think this question is probably vague on purpose. Like, I don't know what exactly you mean by that, but what jumped to mind was I remember when I went to see the movie Pet Sematary as maybe a middle schooler, and it was like right in that period where like I was having issues with horror. So I went through these periods where I was really into horror, and then horror really scared me too much, and I was in one of those periods. And there was a moment though where so for a while I'm watching the movie and I'm kind of like wanting to run out of the theater. But then there's a moment where the crowd kind of got into it, and I sort of got into it, and I feel like it was a big moment in like sort of finding a lot of joy in horror. And the movie ends with this great creepy ending, and then it smash cuts to the credits with the Ramones singing this ridiculous song, "I Want to Be Buried in a Pet Cemetery," and it's such a fun like moment, and like everyone was cheering, and so I'm gonna go with Ramones' "Pet Cemetery."
I love that. And yeah, it is vague. I like seeing how people interpret it. I have people say like, this is my final confrontation, my like gearing up to fight back song. This is my like Sally Hardesty on the back of the truck moment. This is my like end credit song. So like I love seeing how people take it. What about you, Konrad?
Yeah, I went with so I was trying to think of a horror movie that I had a connection to, that had a song that I was really into. And then I sort of settled upon like the essence of the final girl's story, which I feel is very much an arc a lot of the time from, not necessarily like a meek person, but they're going through this experience and they're learning just how much they can handle and what they are capable of. And they're gaining all of this perspective because of the horror that they are experiencing. And so it's really a story about the growth of that person. And finding, sort of the strength within themselves. So I went with Stronger by Britney Spears because, I mean, it's Britney. And, specifically to the song, too, like, it's sort of a play on Baby One More Time, where she's lonely and then, she's not lonely anymore. So it's just a very, like, powerful anthem song about strength and independence. And so I thought that fits with the essence of a final girl.
Absolutely does. I'm stronger than yesterday.
Mm-hmm.
Thank you both so much for coming on and chatting with me about summer scares.
Yeah, definitely. Thank you so much for having us.
Very well.
Yeah, where can people find you online?
For me, it's danielkraus.com, and I am sometimes on Twitter, but sometimes not.
Probably a good way to be.
Yeah, I'm also sometimes on Twitter and sometimes not. More often than not, but you can still find me there. And it's just my name, Konrad Stump, or at Konrad Stump. See, that's how much I use it. And then I'm also on Instagram under the Po-Tie Librarian. So some people might read it as the Poety Librarian, because that's how I set that up. But it's the Po-Tie Librarian on Instagram. And, you could just Google me.
All right, well, listeners, be sure to check the links that'll be in the show notes and look into summer scares. And if you're a librarian, look into having some of this programming at your library. So thank you both so much. Books in the Freezer is a bi-weekly podcast. We post episodes every other Tuesday. You can find us on Twitter at BooksFreezerPod or on Instagram and TikTok at Books in the Freezer. And you can send us an email at booksinthefreezer@gmail.com. Show notes for this episode are at booksinthefreezer.com, and they will include a list of the books mentioned, where to find the guests for today's episode, affiliate links, and links for Patreon and other ways to support the podcast. One way to show your support for the podcast is to leave a review on a site like Spotify or Apple Podcasts. And I'm going to read the latest 5-star review left by No Names Left 5566. I feel that. The title is Gave Me Back the Desire to Read. I had almost completely given up reading for I don't even know how long. And then I came across Stephanie on TikTok around 2 years ago. It was her wildly successful extreme horror video, which piqued my interest immediately. As soon as I found out she had this podcast, I subscribed, and I look forward to the release of each episode. Stephanie is smart and funny and has a unique take on books from a variety of horror subgenres. Her guests are always witty and enjoyable to listen to, and my TBR cart grows with every episode. Thanks, Stephanie, for giving me back the desire to read. Thank you so much for this review. There's so much I love about it. I am so happy that you have found your desire to read again and that this podcast played a part in it. I also agree that the guests that I usually have on this podcast are very funny and witty and fun to listen to. So thank you so much for listening. And thank you to all of you who have taken time to leave a review on Apple Podcasts and Spotify. If you are a librarian and you are planning on participating in summer scares, I would love to hear all about it. This is also in conjunction with the Horror Writers Association. And if you are going to StokerCon this year, that is going to be in Pittsburgh, I will be on a panel with Daniel Kraus and Clay McLeod Chapman talking about the Summer Scares program and horror in libraries. If you're going, it seems like there's going to be a lot of great panels that day, so I suggest it's something you look into. Like I saw there was going to be like an extreme horror panel with like Brian Keene and Rath James White and Eric LaRocca and like a romance horror panel. So it really looks like it's a good time, good investment overall. And if you are not able to make the trek out to Pittsburgh, I do believe there is a virtual option for attendance where you can still watch some of the panels virtually. But anyway, I am Stephanie. You can find me on Twitter at lady_Gagnon. That's LADY_GAGNON, or on Instagram at That's What She Read, and that's with 2 A's. Thank you so much for listening, and see you next time on Books in the Freezer.